So we press onward with our lightning intro to linguistics, and this part is going to be about phonology. So that is mostly what I do, although I also do phonetics. Yeah, what is phonology about? Well, so far we've seen that there are some small units that have meanings, and I've been using the term words, although probably we're really talking about something more like morphemes here. And then there are rules for combining those smaller units to make larger units that also have meanings, like phrases or constituents or sentences of various types. Uh, and yeah, so that's sort of what we've looked at so far in syntax and semantics. Interestingly, the smaller units of meaning, those words or morphemes, are themselves made up of even smaller parts that don't have a meaning. And this actually is a property that might make human languages different from every other animal communication system. So this is sometimes called duality of patterning. Right? So you have these larger units that are meaningful, and they're in turn composed of smaller units that are not meaningful. What do I mean by that? Well, for instance, the English word methods, which is in the title of this class, is made up of a bunch of sounds, and it would generally be written in the International Phonetic Alphabet like this, right? So each of these symbols stands for a particular way that humans can create a sound in their vocal tract. For instance, this initial letter M, as you might expect from the English writing system and from other European writing systems, stands for the sound M, and that particular sound is defined as a sound that's made with your lips pressed together to create a constriction at the lips, a vibrating glottis or vibrating vocal folds, your oral cavity coupled to your nasal cavity. In other words, it's a bilabial nasal stop, and that's what that symbol stands for. Some of these look a lot like the letters that we use in our alphabetic writing systems. Some of them don't. So this letter actually is a theta from the Greek alphabet, but here it's standing for the sound th, which is an interdental fricative, a voiceless one. And so each sound has a way of notating it. And what I mean by meaningless parts is that there's nothing meaningful about the sound m, right? There's nothing meaningful about the sound th. Right? There's nothing meaningful about the string of sounds metha, right? These are not in and of themselves anything that carries meaning. It's not like, everything that's a way of carrying out research begins with the sound m in English. It's not meaningful in that way. These are arbitrary. Which kinds of sounds are going to end up in a particular word? It's something you just have to learn either as an infant, if it's your first language, or at a later age, if it's a foreign language. It's not something that can be predicted, right? It's just sort of arbitrary which sounds are going to be in which words, and that's what I mean when I say that they're meaningless. The only exception here actually is this last sound, z. That is not quite meaningless in English because it is in and of itself a morpheme. It's the plural morpheme. And so reliably, at the end of a word, if the word is plural, you will get this some version of this z sound. It's going to vary a little bit based on the phonological context, but there is a limited sense in which this particular occurrence of the sound z is meaningful, but in the general case, there is no meaning ascribed to a voiced sibilant fricative in English, right? Okay, so that's what I mean by arbitrary or by smaller parts with no meaning. And phonology is going to be the study of how those smaller units with no particular meaning work. Right here, I'm showing you what are sometimes called segments. That's sort of the individual characters here, each of which defines, in some sense, a single speech sound that can be recombined to make other words in the language. There also might be various larger units in the phonology that group together some of these sounds to the exclusion of others. That is, phonology might have its own constituent structure, just like syntax does, but we're not going to get into that today. Every language also has rules about how these smaller meaningless units, their phones or their segments, can combine with one another to make words or morphemes, or perhaps things like syllables, right? Here's an example of what I'm talking about. Here's what I mean by rules. These are implicit mental rules. Any English speaker knows that toff is a possible English word, and I've written here, even though it doesn't happen to mean anything, Although I'm realizing I think that in British English this is a kind of insult. I don't know exactly what it means. But let's say in American English, the string of sounds toff uh, happens not to be a word, but it easily could be. Right? Um, by the same token, though, any English speaker knows that ktoff is not an existing English word and that it never could be, right? So this is actually already interesting, and you can of course do more subtle or more formal kinds of methods to show that English speakers or speakers of any other language possess knowledge like this implicitly, but for this one it's so straightforward that I think probably we don't even need an experiment to establish this. And it's interesting because it shows that our theory of phonology better be able to explain why some non-existing English words like toff uh, don't exist by accident, but they could be English words. And if I wanted to make an English word toff tomorrow, I could just sort of start using it and people might take it up or might not. Whereas other non-existing English words like ktoff are not even possible, right? So we're going to need to distinguish between non-existent but possible words versus non-existent and impossible words. In order to do that, you're going to have to posit some kind of productive phonological implicit knowledge on the parts of speakers who know the grammar of a language, right? So that's what phonology is about. Now, for any kind of grammatical knowledge or any aspect of a linguistic structure, it's always useful to ask the question, well, is this something that's universal in all languages, or is it something that differs from language to language? And so this fact that toff is possible in English, but ktoff is not, there's a lot of languages that would basically have the same kind of a system, or languages where both of them would be impossible. And here's a question, what about Russian? And if we were in the classroom now, this is where the Russian speaker would say, well, ktoff is not a word, but it could be. It's a perfectly fine word. Russian has words like kto and other words that begin with two stops like this. And so the point here is that not only do you need to have some sort of knowledge to know the difference between possible and impossible words in your language, but also that knowledge has to differ from language to language, right, in order to explain the difference between English and Russian. And for that to happen, it probably means that that implicit grammatical knowledge is learned in the course of acquiring the language. So this is what phonology is about. How do you end up with these implicit systems of knowledge, and how are those systems acquired? Right? So what this is meant to show is that this is not simply a matter of memorizing the words of your language, right? Well, I know that ktoff's not a possible word because it's not in my lexicon. The point is that, well, if you're not British and you've never used the insult before, then toff is also not in your lexicon, but you have no trouble recognizing that as a potential English word. So yeah, these patterns differ across languages. And one of the questions in any area of linguistics, when you have things that vary across languages, is the following question. Do they vary without limit? Are all possible sort of configurations allowed in some language? Or are there limits on the kinds of cross-linguistic variation that you can get? That's what the syntax example was about, showing that there's some degree of variation in whether heads are initial or final in different languages, but not just any system of initial and final phrases is possible. Some of them seem to be ruled out. So we're going to be looking for the same kind of thing in phonology here. And I'm going to illustrate this using an example that we'll go into detail in my Linguistics 411 class, if anybody takes that. And this involves the sound s and sh. And we're going to look at several languages here. This is the IPA symbol for s. It's an anterior voiceless coronal fricative. And this is the IPA symbol for sh, sometimes referred to as esh, and it's a symbol for the non-anterior post-alveolar voiceless fricative. So s and sh. And some of these data are a little bit simplified. In particular, the vowels in these Korean examples are simplified in various ways. But here's a whole bunch of Korean words. Right? And the question is, where does s appear in Korean and where does sh appear? In terms of the, well, I'll just give it away. I'll say in terms of the following sounds, where do they occur? So take a second and try to see if you can figure out what we call the distribution of these two sounds in Korean. What sounds do they occur next to? Okay, so here is the answer. It looks like in Korean, the anterior sibilant fricative, s, can appear before a, before u, before a, before a, can appear before lots of different vowels. But the post-alveolar or the non-anterior fricative esh only appears before the vowel e. Huh, that's interesting. So it looks like s appears before all vowels except e, and sh appears only before e. So when these two sounds that are somewhat similar uh, uh, can never appear in the same place, where they perfectly split up the different places where one of them might occur, we refer to this as complementary distribution in linguistics. So this is just saying that wherever s appears in Korean, you can't get sh, that's before non-e vowels. And wherever sh appears in Korean, you can't find s, that's before e vowels. The IPA symbol I stands for the vowel E. It's a high front unrounded vowel. Interesting. So complementary distribution, esh before E, S elsewhere. Here's how this works in Japanese, and this one's a little bit different. So again, take a minute and see if you can figure out the distribution of S and esh in Japanese in the same way we just did for Korean. It's going to be similar, but not exactly the same. Okay, so we're back now, and here's what's going on in Japanese. Right? So just like in Korean, before the high front unrounded vowel E, right, in these examples, you can only get the sound esh and never the sound s. So you get sh before E, but never s. Before other vowels like O or A or A, you can get either s or sh. So these two sounds in Japanese are not in complementary distribution. They're in partial contrast. What does that mean? Well, before non-E vowels, either sound can appear there, and it's just a matter of lexical arbitrariness, right? This word happens to begin with sa in Japanese. This one happens to begin with sha, and there's nothing systematic about that. It just means that the two sounds are a possible way of contrasting words in Japanese. That's never true in Korean for the same sounds, which is kind of interesting. Before E, however, no contrast is possible. You can only get sh in this position and never s. So we would say that the contrast between s and sh neutralizes before a high front unrounded vowel. So that's kind of interesting. And what else could we look at in this regard? Well, what about in English? And we'll limit our attention here to before vowel sounds. Can s and sh contrast in English? Take a second and try to answer that. And where can they contrast? Okay. So for English, the answer is that s and sh can contrast before any vowel, including E, right? So si and she are both words in English, and they mean different things. And of course, you can do this before other vowels as well. What's a good minimal pair here? Sot and shot. That's a minimal pair. That shows that s and sh are contrastive sounds in English before all vowels, not just before non-E vowels. Okay, how about Spanish? If you're a Spanish speaker, take a second and try to answer this question. It should be a pretty quick answer. The answer is that in Spanish, they don't contrast anywhere because there is no sh sound. There's possible limited exceptions to this in some regional varieties of Spanish that either pronounce the s sound as sh in certain contexts, or that actually pronounce this mysterious, normally palatal sound that's y or j or cha, depending on the variety. I think in some varieties of Argentinian Spanish, that sound, which is usually written in the alphabet with a double L, can actually be pronounced as sh. But ignoring that, in most varieties of Spanish, there is no sh at all. So that's another pattern. There is sa, though, and sa can appear before any vowel in Spanish. Last question here. What about Spanish with the phenomenon known as cefeo? And these are, I guess, some Andalusian varieties. Um, and I mean, the description of the term already gives you the answer in and of itself. These are just like the Spanish we just mentioned, the sort of standard Spanish, except instead of the s sound, they only have a th sound, which is an interdental fricative. So in Spanish with cefeo, there is neither a s sound nor a sh sound. Right? So that's another pattern that we're going to need to account for. And so now we've looked at what, 4 or 5 different kinds of patterns of how s and sh can be distributed in a language. I've been trying to use languages that are spoken in this class as examples, but I'm going to leave Russian out of this one because this is way more complicated in Russian, in part due to the vowel system and in part due to a bunch of secondary features that different consonants have in Russian. So we're just going to leave Russian aside because there's just a lot more sounds involved and it's complicated. All right, so here's some patterns that we've seen so far. And in this chart, I'm just giving you s and sh before a high front unrounded vowel like e, and s and sh before other vowels. And I've written as the vowel here, but this is standing in for any vowel that isn't e. Right? So here are some patterns we've seen. In English, you can have either sound before any kind of a vowel. In Japanese, you can have either sound before most vowels, but not before E. There you only get the non-anterior sh sound. In Korean, you can only have the anterior one s before most vowels, except before E, where you can only have the non-anterior one sh. In standard Spanish, or most varieties of Spanish, you can only have the anterior one, and it appears before all vowels, and you never get the non-anterior one. Sorry, I should have said at the beginning, these asterisks are usually used in both phonology and syntax to represent something that's ungrammatical in a language. And so when I'm putting these in the charts, what I mean is that having a s sound followed by a high front vowel in Korean or in Japanese is not possible. It's ungrammatical. It's ill-formed in these languages. This last one is just showing you there are some languages that don't have any of these sounds. For instance, varieties of Spanish with cefeo. These are all patterns that our theory of phonology is going to need to be able to analyze. Right? If our job is to explain how sound patterns differ between languages in a way that children can acquire different patterns, then we're going to need to explain how a child can acquire any of these different patterns that we've seen so far. Here are 2 patterns that you could imagine in addition. Right? The first one has contrast before E vowels. You can either have C words or she words, but before other vowels, the contrast neutralizes and only sa is possible, never sh. Here's a second language that we haven't seen yet. Here, there's also complementary distribution, except it's the opposite of Korean. Before high front vowels like E, you only get the anterior fricative s. Before other vowels, you only get the non-anterior fricative sh. As you can imagine, given that I've called these missing patterns and I've put question marks over here, these are not patterns that seem to exist in any language that's ever been documented, which is quite a few languages. So if that's systematic, it shows that there's some cross-linguistic variation, right, in how these s and sh sounds are distributed with regard to following vowels, but it's not unlimited variation. There are some combinations here that seem to never pop up in human languages. And so I can't tell you what the right answer is to why this happens, although I do have some ideas. But this is the kind of question that phonologists work on. This is the kind of thing that we're ultimately wanting to analyze is, why do you get some grammars but not other grammars? What goes into that? So that's what phonology is fundamentally about. Now, we're looking at universals here, right, in the sense that they're statements that hold over all languages. But these ones are not absolute universals, right? They're not statements of the form, hey, every language has s, or every language has sh, right? That's not what these statements look like. These are called implicational universals, and they're far, far more common, at least in phonology, than the absolute universals, right? This is the most common form of universal statement that you find in phonology. These take the form, if some language does thing X, then they also do thing Y, or they never do thing Y, or so on and so forth. So there's two parts in implicational universals. Here are some of the ones that emerge from the sounds that we were just looking at. If S and Sh can contrast before E, then they can contrast before other vowels. All languages that we've seen seem to obey that implicational universal. If S can appear before E, then it can also appear before other vowels. I could go on and make more of these statements. Just this relatively small example using, 4 sounds or something like that already gives us a bunch of interesting material that our theory of phonology is going to need to explain. If you want to learn more about this, we go into this case study at length in my 411 introductory phonology class, and we will look in more detail at how this works, and to some extent why it works the way it does instead of working some other way. That's what phonological theory is about, is describing and hopefully ultimately explaining universals like this.